Beneath the surface of the Arizona desert lies a landscape almost nobody sees. Collapsed lava tubes from ancient volcanic fields, limestone caverns carved slowly by water that no longer flows, abandoned mine shafts sunk a century ago and never mapped again. Most of it stays hidden, noticed only when the ground gives way beneath a rancher's fence line or a hiker's boot. For over a century, prospectors and surveyors crossing this desert have stumbled onto openings in the earth that led somewhere deeper than anyone expected. Some no wider than a kitchen table, others opening into passages long enough that no one who entered them ever mapped the full extent. Most of those openings turned out to be nothing more than what they appeared to be. A small number never got a satisfying explanation at all. Long before any of those surveys took place, Apache tradition was already describing what existed beneath this land, not as empty rock, but as the remains of a world that came before this one. A world some traditions say never fully emptied out. Then, in the spring of 1936, a rancher working land near the Salt River Canyon in eastern Arizona filed a report with the county that decades later, researchers still can't fully explain. We'll return to what he claimed to find beneath a collapsed section of his grazing land, because it would eventually be compared to a tradition Apache communities had already been carrying for generations, long before his fence line ever crossed that ground. To understand why that 1936 report still generates debate today, we need to go back further to the oldest layer of Apache tradition connected to the world beneath the desert floor, a tradition that has nothing to do with sinkholes, ranchers, or county records, and everything to do with how the present world came to exist at all. The Apache are not one nation but several. The Western Apache, Chiricahua, Mescalero, Jicarilla, and Lipan among them, each with its own language, homeland, and body of oral tradition, shaped by centuries of movement across the American Southwest. Despite those differences, many Apache groups carry a broadly similar account of how this world came to be. According to that account, the people did not begin here. They began in an earlier world, sometimes described as existing beneath this one, where humanity lived before the present age began. Guided by holy beings, among them figures remembered as white-painted woman and her sons, and watched over by the life-giving force many Apache call Usen, the people eventually emerged from that earlier world into the one we know today. What makes this tradition especially relevant to what lies beneath the desert is a detail carried in several tellings across different Apache communities. Not everyone made that journey upward. According to these accounts, certain beings, sometimes described as animal people, sometimes as an older and stranger form of humanity, remained behind in the world below. They were not remembered as evil. They were remembered as older, tied permanently to a world that had already been left behind by the time the present age began, a world that never disappeared, only closed itself off from the surface. Different Apache communities describe the boundary between that world and this one differently, some as a literal opening in the earth, others as something closer to a spiritual threshold, but the underlying idea persists across nearly every telling. What is below has never simply been empty. For generations, this understanding stayed almost entirely within Apache communities, passed through oral tradition rather than through outside documentation. It had no connection to ranchers, county surveyors, or newspapers. Then, in 1936, a man with no apparent knowledge of Apache tradition opened a collapsed section of desert floor on his own land and found something that, without meaning to, echoed a story that had already existed for generations. Today, we're examining that 1936 report, the Apache oral traditions that came long before it, and the question that still surrounds a stretch of desert near the Salt River Canyon. Was what he found simply an unusual cave system, or does the Arizona desert still hold something that was never meant to fully close off from the world above it? Walter Coombs had been running cattle on a stretch of land near the Salt River Canyon for nearly a decade by the spring of 1936. And by his own account, he had crossed the section of desert behind his eastern fence line more times than he could remember, checking water lines and mending wire in every kind of weather the high desert could produce. That March, following an unusually wet winter, a section of ground roughly 20 feet across gave way without warning, swallowing part of a fence post and, according to Coombs, nearly taking one of his horses with it. What he found when he climbed down into the opening wasn't the shallow depression he expected. The sinkhole led into a wider chamber, and that chamber opened into a narrow passage extending further than his lantern light could reach. Coombs returned 2 days later with a longer rope, a stronger lantern, and his teenage son, and together they explored roughly 200 feet of connected passage before the air grew thin enough that they decided to turn back. In the report he later filed with the county recorder's office seeking documentation before word of the sinkhole spread and attracted trespassers, Coombs described smooth-walled chambers, unlike any natural cave formation he had seen in the area, sections of wall that appeared deliberately worked rather than eroded. And in one chamber near the deepest point he reached, a scattering of worked stone tools alongside several fragments of pottery, unlike anything he recognized from the Apache and Hohokam artifacts already familiar to local ranchers and collectors. He noted, almost as an afterthought, that the air deep in the passage stayed noticeably cooler than it should have, even accounting for the depth. Word of the discovery reached the Gila County Bulletin within the month. In April 1936, the paper ran a short item describing a cave of mystery discovered on a local ranch, noting the unusual worked stone and the rancher's plan to bring in a proper survey team before the summer heat made further exploration unsafe. The item ran alongside routine county news, cattle prices, and road repair notices, treated as one curiosity among many rather than anything requiring urgency. The article was brief, framed more as local color than serious news, and it included no photographs of the chamber Coombs described. Before we continue, if you enjoy documentaries that explore forgotten history through oral tradition, archival records, and unresolved discoveries, consider subscribing. It helps this channel keep researching stories exactly like this one. The survey team never came. Coombs's follow-up letters to the county, preserved in the recorder's files, grow increasingly frustrated over the following year, first requesting funding assistance for a proper excavation, then simply asking that someone, anyone, come look at what he had found before the entrance collapsed further. He mentioned in his final surviving letter that he had gone back down alone twice more, each time finding the passage a little narrower than before, as though the desert itself were slowly working to close what the winter rains had opened. No response survives in the archive. By 1938, Coombs had stopped mentioning the cave in his correspondence entirely, and a 1941 survey of the property, conducted for an unrelated water rights dispute, makes no mention of any cave system at all. For decades, the story existed only as a page in the county recorder's archive, unread by anyone outside a small circle of local historians. It resurfaced in the 1990s when researchers digitizing Gila County's Depression-era records found Coombs's original report, his follow-up letters, and the brief 1936 newspaper clipping filed together, exactly where a records clerk had placed them more than 50 years earlier. That discovery raised an obvious question. If Coombs really found what he described, where did the artifacts go? Why did a documented discovery, reported to the county and covered, however briefly, in the local paper, generate so little follow-up, and why did the cooler air Coombs described deep in the passage, along with the worked stone he found there, so closely resemble details Apache oral tradition had already been describing for generations about a world below the desert floor that had never fully sealed itself off? As interest in the Coombs report grew among regional historians, the obvious next step was to search for confirmation. If a rancher had genuinely reported a worked stone chamber system to county officials, in 1936 there should have been at least an internal memo explaining why no survey team was ever sent, or a follow-up file noting the site had been deemed unremarkable. After a brief inspection, researchers found neither. Gila County's surviving records from the period contain no indication that anyone from the county, the state, or any university ever visited the Coombs property to evaluate the find. For some historians, that silence was reason enough to treat the entire account skeptically. An isolated rancher, working alone in difficult terrain during the hardest years of the Depression, possibly overstating an ordinary erosion cave in hopes of drawing outside attention and assistance to an otherwise struggling ranch. But others pointed out that 1936 was an unusually poor year for that kind of oversight to happen by design, Arizona's county governments were operating on skeleton budgets throughout the Depression, and state antiquities enforcement, still in its early years following the 1906 Antiquities Act, relied heavily on voluntary reporting with little capacity to follow up on most claims that came in from private landowners. County recorders during this period were often managing several unrelated responsibilities at once, with no dedicated staff to evaluate the accuracy of an amateur discovery before deciding whether it merited a costly site visit. It was entirely possible for a genuine discovery to simply fall through the cracks of an underfunded system, filed, acknowledged, and then quietly forgotten. That doesn't confirm what Coombs described finding underground, but it does explain why the absence of a follow-up survey doesn't automatically mean there was nothing worth surveying. Some researchers also noted a detail buried in Coombs's second letter to the county, one that rarely gets mentioned in retellings of the story. He wrote that a Western Apache ranch hand who had worked with him for several seasons refused to go back down into the passage after the first visit, telling Coombs that the chamber belonged to something that had never left, and that no good would come from disturbing it further. According to the letter, the same man had grown noticeably quiet after learning where exactly on the property the sinkhole had opened, as though the location itself carried some significance Coombs had no way of understanding. Coombs recorded the refusal with visible frustration, treating it as an inconvenience rather than information worth taking seriously. Later researchers, encountering the letter decades afterward, have been considerably more curious about it. That detail becomes especially interesting once placed beside Apache oral tradition. A rancher describes smooth-walled underground chambers, worked stone, unlike known local artifact styles, and unusually cool air deep beneath the desert floor. Apache tradition, carried across multiple related nations, describes an earlier world existing beneath this one, home to beings who never completed the journey upward when the rest of humanity emerged into the present age. Neither source proves the other. A rancher's report filed with a county recorder in 1936 cannot confirm a tradition carried across generations long before Arizona had counties at all, and an oral tradition cannot serve as forensic evidence for what Coombs's lantern actually illuminated 200 feet beneath his own fence line. But the parallel is difficult to dismiss, especially once the geology of the region is taken into account. Eastern Arizona sits atop one of the most extensively cave-riddled landscapes in the American Southwest, shaped by ancient volcanic activity and centuries of water erosion through limestone bedrock. Cartner Caverns, discovered less than 100 miles away in 1974, remained completely unknown to the outside world for nearly 15 years after its discovery, specifically because its explorers kept the location secret to protect it. If a cave system of that scale could stay hidden for 15 years by deliberate choice, it is entirely plausible that a smaller, less publicized system could disappear from the record simply through neglect, one collapsed entrance and one forgotten county file at a time. Perhaps that is why the Coombs report never resolved itself in either direction, not because someone proved what he found or didn't find, but because the desert itself has never made it easy to check. Nearly 90 years have passed since Walter Coombs climbed down into a sinkhole on his own ranch and found something the county never came to see. The site itself has never been formally rediscovered. Researchers who tried to relocate it using Coombs's original description found the surrounding terrain had shifted enough through decades of erosion and at least one recorded flash flood that the exact entrance he described may no longer be accessible, if it still exists in a form anyone could recognize at all. That unresolved status has kept the story circulating quietly among regional historians and cave researchers, most of whom treat it as an intriguing footnote rather than a confirmed discovery. But it continues to return because it asks a question that was never fully answered. If Coombs exaggerated an ordinary erosion cave, why did his own account grow more frustrated and specific over time, rather than less, the pattern of someone documenting a real disappointment rather than embellishing a story for attention? And if he genuinely found what he described, what happened to the chambers, the worked stone, and whatever else might still be sitting beneath that stretch of desert, waiting for the ground to open again? The deeper question this story raises, about what the Arizona desert holds beneath its surface, and who has the right to decide what happens to it, hasn't stayed confined to the past. It's playing out right now, less than 200 miles from where Coombs filed his report, at a place called Oak Flat. Known to the San Carlos Apache and other Apache communities as Chichil-Bildigatil, Oak Flat sits within what was, until recently, the Tonto National Forest, land many Apache people consider sacred, a place where ceremonies have been conducted for generations, and where, according to tribal members, prayers are understood to travel directly to the Creator. In 2014, a rider attached to a much larger federal defense bill ordered the eventual transfer of Oak Flat to Resolution Copper, a mining company planning to extract one of the largest untapped copper deposits in North America using a method called block cave mining, in which rock is removed from far beneath the surface until the ground above gradually collapses downward under its own weight. For over a decade, a group called Apache Stronghold fought that transfer through the federal court system, arguing that destroying Oak Flat would permanently end religious practices tied to the land. In May 2025, the Supreme Court declined to hear the case. In March 2026, following further denials from the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, the federal government formally transferred more than 2,000 acres of Oak Flat to Resolution Copper. Company officials have stated that surface access to the campground area will remain largely intact in the near term, while Apache Stronghold has continued pursuing further legal challenges, arguing the eventual mining process will still collapse the ground into a crater roughly 2 miles wide, permanently ending the ceremonies the site has hosted for generations. Whatever side of that dispute a person finds most compelling, the underlying idea connects directly back to everything this documentary has examined. Apache tradition has never treated what lies beneath the desert floor as empty space simply waiting to be extracted. It has been understood, across generations and across multiple related nations, as a place with its own history, its own significance, and in some tellings, its own inhabitants who never fully left. Whether that understanding describes something literal, something spiritual, or a way of holding a landscape with the seriousness it deserves, is something each Apache community continues to define for itself, exactly as it always has. What Walter Coombs found, or thought he found, beneath his ranch in 1936 was never confirmed and likely never will be. What is happening at Oak Flat right now is not in question at all. Both stories, separated by 90 years and 200 miles, return to the same underlying idea that the ground beneath the Arizona desert has never simply been empty rock waiting to be opened, and that what happens when it finally is opened has consequences that outlast whoever makes that choice. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this look at a tradition that connects a nearly forgotten 1936 report to events unfolding right now, consider subscribing for more documentaries exploring forgotten history through oral tradition, archival records, and unresolved discoveries. And before you go, I'd like to hear your thoughts. Do you think what Coombs found and what Apache tradition describes are simply two unrelated stories about caves in the desert? Or could they be pointing toward the same understanding of what the ground beneath us is actually meant to hold? Let me know in the comments, and I'll see you in the next documentary.